Thank you very much, Charles, and hello, everybody. I hope it's as sunny wherever you are as it is here sitting in Oxford. Well, a couple of weeks ago, we looked at the Opus 18 quartets of Beethoven, and we saw that the new kid on the block in Vienna was more than a worthy successor to Haydn and Mozart. Now we're moving on from 1800 to 1806 with the three quartets commissioned by the Russian Count Kirill Razumovsky. Between 1800 and 1806, rather a lot had happened. Most crucially in Beethoven's life, his worsening deafness. And in the year 1802, he gave vent to his despair in the so-called Heiligenstadt Testament, in which he mentioned that he actually contemplated committing suicide, but he resolved to triumph over his despair through his art, and he was going to strike out on a new path. And the first obvious fruit of this new path was the mighty Eroica Symphony. He proved there that he meant business by striking out on a new path. And you can say that that was a monumental piece of self-therapy, writing the Eroica Symphony, with the tragic funeral march, but ending with the triumphant finale. And that is basically the narrative of so many Beethoven works, tragedy to triumph, and a kind of willpower, the determination to make everything right in the end. And you could say that these Razumovsky quartets of 1806 are to the string quartet what the Eroica is to the symphony, especially number one, the F major quartet. In these Razumovsky quartets, the string quartet really becomes a symphony for four instruments. There's a huge expansion of scale, especially in number one. And we sense sort of personal and moral messages here. Art is not merely for entertainment, but to actually make the human beings different, preferably better. So let's kick off then with the finale of the third of the three Razumovsky quartets. This is the C major quartet, opus 59, number 3. No viola jokes here. You'll see the viola launches the movement with a long moto perpetuo fugal subject, and the second violin and the cello and first violin join in turn. It doesn't remain a fugue for very long. It's a wonderful combination here of fugue, Beethoven showing off his contrapuntal prowess, fugue and sonata form. And you'll notice that the opening paragraph, long opening paragraph, is conceived as a continuous crescendo. There's also a very strong element of theatrical excitement, and theatrical is a crucial word, I think, when we are considering the Razumovsky quartets. Beethoven imagining 40 rather than 4 instruments by the time he gets to the first fortissimo. And it's interesting, above a sketch for this movement, Beethoven wrote, "Let your deafness no longer be a secret, not even in art." And you can easily imagine that this movement, it really is a triumphant resolve to conquer his despair through sheer willpower, although of course it helps if you're a genius. You tend to conquer more easily that way. So let's then hear, with the Tokac quartet here, let's just hear the opening minute or so of the C major quartet, opus 59, number 3, finale. So there is a heroic quality, and the word heroic is very hard to avoid with many of the works of Beethoven's middle period, you know, beginning with the Eroica Symphony. But you'll have heard, especially towards the end of that extract, there's a kind of comic opera flavour as well, with the instruments chattering and answering each other. There's a kind of Mozartian spirit there. So in this wonderful finale, you get fugue, you get sonata form, you get a heroism, but you also get a sense of fun and a sense of comic opera, sort of bantering exchange there. And it makes an absolutely brilliant, and incredibly virtuosic, of course, finale to the last of the three Opus 59 quartets. Goethe, the great German poet Goethe, described the string quartet as a conversation between four intelligent people. But quite often in the Razumovskys, as some of you will know already, because I expect some of you have played them, the conversation becomes something like sort of determined ensemble shouting. Well, this set of quartets was written for Count Kirill Razumovsky, who, like so many of the aristocrats in Vienna, was an accomplished player himself. He often played the second violin in his own private string quartet. It was very much an aristocratic and salon culture, just beginning to become more public. But the audience, and incidentally, they often clapped not only between movements, but they clapped at bits within movements that particularly took their fancy. I mean, unthinkable today, probably the end of that loud passage that we heard there, you know, the huge crescendo, there would have been applause at the first performance. But I think that's a tradition we could do without now. When they were publicly performed in 1807, the Razumovsky quartets, the critics, who were not really in the Beethoven circle, so they found Beethoven sort of dangerously revolutionary. Well, some of them thought that Beethoven had completely lost it, that these are the works of a madman. An Italian violinist admitted, called Felix Radicati, admitted he found them incomprehensible. And Beethoven retorted, "Oh, they're not for you, but for a later age." Well, this story may have grown in the telling, but it does underline the fact that the Razumovsky quartets, far more than the Opus 18, were regarded from the very beginning, with good reason, as difficult music. And it took amateurs a hell of a long time to master their technical challenges, if they ever did master them. A couple of quartet playing friends of mine reckon that Opus 59 number 1, the first of the Razumovskys, is actually the most difficult of all the Beethoven quartets. So here is Beethoven painted just a couple of years before he composed the Razumovskys in 1804, holding a lyre there, so Beethoven as Orpheus, with his gaze fixed in the middle distance, very much, you know, the composer as a visionary or as a prophet. The first of the Razumovskys, Opus 59 number 1, many people found that these quartets simply too long, and the number 1 almost certainly was the longest string quartet ever composed by 1806. This really is the Eroica among Beethoven's quartets, combining a formal expansiveness with an unprecedented weight and density of argument. For the first time in a 4-movement work, I think it's fair to say, all 4 movements are in elaborate sonata form with an incredibly complex working out of the motifs. It's a kind of sonata orgy. And the very opening, well, it begins here as a string trio. Not surprisingly, this is a favorite work of many cellists, and there are going to be some of you listening who have played, some of you cellists who have played this, a wonderful cantabile opening theme. And at the beginning, we just have a string trio. The first violin has a few bars rest before it enters. Combination of tranquility and spaciousness, but also a certain tension, and that tension becomes very apparent when the first violin enters, and instead of tonic harmony, we have dominant harmony, but the G, the repeated G in the cello 9 is in the second inversion, the unstable second inversion. Beethoven, if any other composer had thought of this, he probably would have written a C, repeated C natural, a fifth below in the cello, but Beethoven keeps the tension and a sense of sort of floating instability going by having the cello playing in the second inversion. There is again, as we heard in the finale that we just sampled, a sense of a continual crescendo. And when the tonic chord of F major is finally sounded in its root position in bar 17, there's a wonderful sense of arrival with a continual tension. You know, when will it actually happen? Well, it does, and no composer is such a master of keeping you in suspense for so long as Beethoven. So we're over a minute into the movement and we're still in F major. We know already that Beethoven is working here on a huge canvas, a real test of stamina. But every single detail in this movement is absolutely meticulously planned, everything falling into its supremely satisfying place here. And I want to scroll on now to the point at which the main theme returns in the recapitulation. As in the Eroica Symphony, Beethoven writes a huge development section with lots of fugal writing and taking us around the harmonic universe and exploring so many different textures. And you won't need to be told by now that the recapitulation, you know, the return in any Beethoven movement, especially first movement, is an event, a dramatic event. And here we have, as you see, a crescendo to fortissimo, then the top three instruments come down the scale as the cello comes up the scale, and we have the main theme at the letter R on the second stanza returning in the cello as before, but against the falling scale continuing in the first violin, so that there's a surprise there that the scale is still continuing when the main theme arrives. We continue more or less as we first heard it up until the bottom stave. No, the second bottom stave, the last two bars, we have a dip into F minor, and then the unstable floating G naturals become G flats at the letter S, and we have a wonderful modulation to the distant key of D flat major. So Beethoven, you know, having set up instability at the very beginning of the movement with the second inversion G naturals repeated in the cello, dips down the letter S in the recapitulation to G flat, and we go into D flat major, wonderful sort of sense of warmth and lyrical consolation there, with the first violin, as you see, soaring up to its highest register at the bottom of the page there. So let's hear this absolutely transcendent moment of recapitulation and Beethoven working out the implications of the opening instability. So we landed there in D flat major, and Beethoven pilots us smoothly out of it. But, you know, a wonderfully imaginative rethinking of the opening music there at the start of the recapitulation. And we've already seen that with Opus 18, but even more so with these middle period quartets, Opus 59. When things come round again, it's never the same. You know, we are changed people after going through that development, just like in the opening movement of the Eroica. You know, we're not the same people that we were at the start of the movement, and the music cannot be the same either. So let's just hear, though, the final section of the movement. We still haven't had a really resounding resolution of the opening instability, and Beethoven provides that in spades in the coda, where we have long held pedal notes, F and C, open fifths there, giving a slightly rustic flavour, sort of bagpipe drones. And the letter X, you'll hear how the main theme, which was originally smooth and piano, is thundered out fortissimo, high on the first violin, with sforzando accents off the beat, typical Beethoven. We saw that last time, didn't we? And the cello rooted at the bottom there with those open fifths, the F and C open fifths. So it's a huge spacing of the parts there. That's such a characteristic, both of Beethoven's quartet writing, and if there are any pianists among you, you'll know that, especially in his middle and late period sonatas, it's a huge characteristic of Beethoven's piano writing, maximum spacing, often leaving huge gaps between treble and bass. So let's then hear this amazing moment of resolution there. F major in spades. I need to. And from here on, we are in an unclouded F major. We're about 40 seconds or so from the end of the movement there, but the amazingly satisfying resolution of all the tensions that have been built up during the course of the movement. And that's, again, exactly what Beethoven does in the first movement of the Eroica, where the tensions of the exposition and development are resolved in the coda, where the main theme is kind of distilled into its most elemental form. Well, the second movement, unexpected to say the least. I think of all the movements in Opus 59, this is the one where hostile early critics were convinced that Beethoven had completely lost it. He was off his trolley, you know, Beethoven, the madman, beginning with this absurdly, you might say, minimalist theme. Well, it isn't a theme, it's just a rhythm, isn't it, for the cello, answered by the second violin. And then we have, in an alien key, after B flat, we have A flat, with the same process repeated in the viola and the first violin. This is one of my favorite movements in all Beethoven. It's amazingly complex, but it's also fun, it's playful. Themes are fragmentary, you know, often divided, as we see at the very beginning, between instruments. There's an amazing variety of keys. You just never know what Beethoven is going to do next, but it all hangs together, as always in Beethoven. It coheres, and the fragmentation of texture, yeah, instability of key, dynamic contrasts as well. I mean, on that first page, we have pianissimo, and by the letter A, that rhythm that we heard here at the very beginning from the cello is thundered out fortissimo. So let's then hear, and again, the cello has the first word, not surprising, this is a favorite cello quartet. Let's hear then the opening, allegretto vivace, sempre scherzando, that's scherzando, jokey. So Beethoven, the humorist, you know, he was one of music's great humorists, and that's nowhere more evident, I think, than in this capricious movement. Someone once said that of all composers, Beethoven's themes are the ones that it is most easy to identify by their rhythms alone. And if you just look at the opening of this movement, you can see what that writer meant, that drum rhythm there. And it also reminds us that, yeah, he's obviously thinking of a drum at the very beginning, and Beethoven's quartets so often conjuring other sound worlds, often orchestral sound worlds, of course, we've already heard that. Well, after playfulness, instability, it's a kind of an inspired absurdity about this movement, I always think. And after that, we have a total contrast with the third movement, the slow movement, adagio molto e mesto, so very slow, e mesto, sad. Yes, that is underlined indeed, the sadness. We are in F minor here, sottovoce, so, you know, the instruments playing in an undertone, sottovoce, and so many sighing, grieving appoggiaturas in the melody. This is one of Beethoven's great tragic slow movements. And over the movement, when he wrote it out, he wrote the inscription, "A willow or acacia tree over my brother's grave." So what was Beethoven thinking about? He actually had lost two brothers in infancy when he was a boy. Two of his brothers had died. Maybe he was thinking of his two brothers many years ago. But another suggestion is that his brother Carl, who was very much alive, had just made a marriage that Beethoven didn't approve of. And it may be, that may be a jokey reference to his brother's marriage, which Beethoven thought was a disaster. However, the music itself is anything but jokey. Let's hear then the Adagio molto e mesto with all those grieving, sighing appoggiaturas, leaning notes, and the first violin having the tune, but then the melody appears in the cello, high in the cello. If you remember the slow movement of Opus 18, number 1, the first of the Opus 18 quartets, we have a similar tragic slow movement. I think this is even more tragic here, that starts with first violin and then the tune passes to the cello. Beethoven does the same thing here. another great moment for the cello there, isn't it? And what starts off as a lament for soprano as first violin develops at the end there into a duet, tragic operatic style duet for tenor as cello and the soprano first violin there. This really is a most devastating movement, plumbing the depths of despair, tragedy there. How does Beethoven get us out of this? Well, at the very end, the tragic mood dissolves in a first violin cadenza. We can see the end of the cadenza on the screen there, a florid first violin cadenza, the kind of evaporating tragedy. And then after a trill, the finale begins. Thème russe, yes. Well, when Count Razumovsky commissioned these quartets, he asked Beethoven to include a Russian tune in each of the three quartets. Well, he does that in two of the three. And the first of the Russian themes, the Thème russe, is in the finale of number 1, played by, again, it's the cello that leads. But Beethoven, I don't know, is he poking fun at the tune? The original tune, the original Russian folk tune is called "Ah, My Luck, Such Luck," and it's sung by a battle-weary soldier. It's a very sad tune, but Beethoven speeds it up and he changes it from modal to essentially F major. There's a twist to D minor at the end there. So he kind of westernizes and cheers up the originally tragic Russian folk song. So, as you heard in that brief extract, there is an element of playfulness in that music, in this finale, which ties it to some extent with the second movement, the Allegretto scherzando. At the very end of the movement, and also a lot of orchestral style writing, we can just see on the page there, Beethoven really tries briefly to make amends for having treated the Russian theme in a frivolous way and speed it up and so on. He slows it right down and he harmonizes it with tragic chromatic harmonies. So he just, at the very last minute, he compensates for having made fun of the Russian folk song. And then we have a brilliant presto end, a very, very kind of symphonic orchestral style ending. So the last few bars of the F major quartet, opus 59, number 1, and slowing that theme down and making it soulful, almost tragic, may have been partly to please Count Razumovsky, who was, we remember, a Russian, and perhaps he was not initially amused at having his country's folk song treated the way that Beethoven did. The second of the Razumovsky quartets could hardly be more different. In fact, each of the three quartets is intensely, perhaps almost aggressively individual. So in contrast to the vast expanses of the first movement of Opus 59, number 1, the first movement of number 2 in E minor, it's nervy, it's compressed, it makes a huge amount of silences, dramatic silences. Just look at the first stave there. We have 2 hammer blows in multiple stopping for the top 3 instruments. Then we have a pause, then we have a fragmentary theme, and then we have a bars rest. Then we go up a semitone from E minor to F major, the so-called Neapolitan second, and then we have another bars rest. I can't think of any other Beethoven quartet movement where the silences are so crucial. Beethoven, drawing such dramatic power from silences. And from the very opening, the tonality is restless, and there are brusque swings between this agitation, restlessness, and a kind of yearning lyricism that's never allowed to flower. Everything breaks off. So it's as if the heroic style, which we have in the Eroica Symphony and in parts of Opus 59, number 1, the heroic style is being questioned. This is music of doubt and uncertainty. And I find it profoundly moving. It's also profoundly unsettling. So here then the opening of the E minor quartet, Opus 59, number 2. So the very disturbing, very unsettled opening page there of the E minor quartet, Opus 59, number 2. It's music of fragmentation that never really settles into any kind of tonal stability for any length of time. Also dynamic stability, and you heard enough there to see what I mean, I hope, about the value, the importance, crucial importance of silence, pauses in this movement. Extreme contrast with the second movement, and if I had to nominate my 2 favorite Beethoven quartet slow movements, this would be one of them. One of the late quartet slow movements would be in there too. But this molto adagio in the key of E major, of Opus 59, number 2. Si tratta questo pezzo con molto di sentimento. This piece must be treated with a great deal of feeling. I mean, the music, Beethoven didn't really need to write that. Just a look at the page and you know that this is music that absolutely demands a great deal of feeling on the part of the players. And it unfolds really as a chorale. You see the chorale beginning at the first note solo, first violin, and the lower instruments enter one by one. There's a slightly archaic feel, J.S. Bach even going a little bit further back, certainly until in bar 3 we have see the C natural in the cello, but until then, shades of a Palestrina motet. So Beethoven looking back into earlier centuries, as he was to do more than once in his late quartets, which we'll see in a couple of weeks. And Beethoven treating filling the chorale scene with wonderful imagination. Each time it appears, of 5 appearances, it is in a different harmony, different texture. But he contrasts that with a more animated drum-like rhythm. Especially clear that at figure A there at the bottom of your screen. So let's then hear with the chorale theme and the other instruments entering one by one. Let's hear the opening of Opus 59, number 2, slow movement, which, according to Beethoven's most famous pupil, Carl Czerny, Beethoven conceived while gazing at, I quote, the star-studded heavens and contemplating the music of the spheres. So there's something unearthly, extraterrestrial, if you like, about this sublime music. Was criminal, isn't it, to break off there, but time moves on. Incidentally, this is a glorious movement for the second violin, who, well, already we heard the second violin taking over the chorale theme at the end of that extract, and there are glorious opportunities for the second violin later on in the movement. At virtually the same time, within weeks of composing that movement, Beethoven composed quite quickly a symphony. There was a commission, quite a lot of money stood on this, and Beethoven wrote his Symphony Number 4 in the summer of 1806. He stopped work actually on that second Razumovsky to write the symphony, and the second movement of the symphony, Adagio, has very much the same combination of cantabile melody, long breathed cantabile melody, and drum-like rhythm. Beethoven fascinated, obviously, by that superimposition of 2 contrasting rhythmic features, and he repeated it in the symphony. The symphony is a more friendly movement. It isn't quite so otherworldly, but the technique is pretty similar. Let's just hear the opening of the Adagio of Symphony Number 4 with second violin thinking it's a drum. So yeah, the opening bars of the Adagio of Symphony Number 4, absolutely contemporary with the second Razumovsky quartet, and Beethoven doing something similar in the 2 slow movements. The third movement of Razumovsky Quartet Number 2, the E minor, Allegretto. Well, this is neither a minuet nor a scherzo. You couldn't possibly begin to dance to this music without ending up in A&E, needing some serious physiotherapy. This is Beethoven enjoying cross rhythms. You'll see there in the score that only the cello is on the beat. The first violin can't quite make up its mind whether it's in 6/8 or 3/4 time. It has a kind of limping quality. There's also a melancholy grace, I think, to this movement too. And you can imagine it took a little bit of practice, a little bit of practice to get precise coordination when the Schuppanzich quartet, who gave the premiere of all the Razumovsky quartets, first tried this out. So a sample of the third movement of the Opus 59 number 2 quartet. Now, here we have another Russian theme in the trio section, the so-called Maggiore, major key section. Thème russe, Beethoven writes, with the theme coming first in the viola. And if you know Mussorgsky's opera Boris Godunov, you'll know this theme because this is a hymn of praise to God, at least it was a hymn of praise to God until Beethoven got hold of it. And as in Quartet number 1, the finale of number 1, Beethoven seems to be poking fun at the Russian tune, and he works it in a kind of rough mock fugal style, first in the viola, then second violin, and so on, against triplet counterpoint. So he's having some fun at the expense of the Russian theme here. And so we go on there. The humorist in Beethoven can rarely be repressed for long, and there's an example there. Well, yeah, I've only got a few minutes left, and yeah, it'd be nice to say something about number 3, which I will quickly. This is the beginning of the third Razumovsky. We heard the finale at the beginning of the talk. Look at the score there, and you have not got a clue in the opening bars, A, of the meter, and B, of the key. Mozart had created something of a furore with his so-called dissonance quartet. The opening of that wanders in a very, very chromatic, cloudy way. But at the very beginning, the cello has repeated C. So Mozart makes it clear that you are in C from the very beginning. Beethoven goes further here by leaving us completely in the dark as to what key we're in, opening with that most malleable, flexible of chords, the diminished seventh, which could go virtually anywhere. Huge dynamic contrast, forte, pianissimo, sempre PP, and then up to forte again. So let's hear this very strange opening to the C major quartet, although you don't know it's C major yet, number 3. So you're groping in the dark there, and you're groping for a couple of minutes. Finally, we get to the Allegro vivace. But even at the beginning of the Allegro vivace, Beethoven hesitates to really affirm the key of C major. It begins with a little sort of fantasy figures for the first violin. We sort of have C major at the beginning, but then we go off towards D minor, and it's only with the first forte, which you see on the last two staves, that Beethoven finally, after, and we've been here about 3 minutes into the work with the introduction, that he finally establishes with that wonderful sense of homecoming, you know, all is right, really. He establishes C major with a huge crescendo, and then really the cello pounding away at repeated Cs with very much with an orchestral style texture. So let's then hear this moment of resolution in the first movement of the C major quartet, 59, number 3. So wonderful sense of liberation, release, isn't it, into the broad daylight of C major after all that uncertainty and darkness of that extraordinary slow introduction. I just thought we'd end today with a comparable piece of darkness into light a couple of years later, a work that you will know, and it's such a typical Beethoven narrative, especially in the key of C. So C minor darkness to C major light and triumph, with a sense of theatricality again, and a sense of sort of overcoming personal obstacles, you know, triumphing over adversity we have in this music. So that was about the most triumphant assertion of C major in the whole of music, the finale of the Fifth Symphony. But Beethoven does something with fewer instruments. He does something similar in the opening movement of the C major quartet, opus 59, number 3. Perhaps just, we've got 1 minute left. I'm just going to scroll on to the amazing F minor quartet, opus 95. We'll end with the opening. This is a completely different Beethoven from the expansiveness on the whole of the Razumovsky quartets. This is really the exercise in compression. You couldn't get more compressed than the F minor quartet. It lasts about 20 minutes, the shortest of all the Beethoven quartets, written in 1810, just before the Seventh Symphony. And this is a revolutionary work in absolutely every way. Beethoven doesn't modulate to new keys. He simply assaults them, he jumps on them. Incredible contrast of texture and dynamics within a very, very, very confined space there. And there's a sense of controlled violence. It's always controlled in Beethoven. There's this magnificent sanity, even when he is at his most extreme, but the controlled violence with little fragments of lyricism, but nothing is ever allowed to flower for very long. The first movement of the second Razumovsky quartet, E minor quartet, has something of the same quality, but this is compressed that much more. So let's hear this ferocious opening of the F minor quartet, Allegro con brio, opus 95. It's the metronome marking added by Beethoven a few years later. Yeah, it's fast, but a lot of quartets these days have proved that it can be done. If the movement lasts much more than 4 minutes, well, you've got it wrong. So here then the opening of the torrential opening F minor quartet, opus 95. So let us end there with Beethoven in tumultuous mood, and really packing a one-act tragedy there into 4 minutes. So thank you very much, and look forward to 1 or 2 questions, I hope.
Thank you very much, Richard. Packing an awful lot into 4 minutes in that opus 95 movement, and you've packed an awful lot into 50 minutes of lecture on these amazing pieces. Thank you so much. As I said to the students, you're most welcome to ask questions. If you want to write anything, which will pop up on my screen, or alternatively, if you want to email questions either to myself or Dr. Jenkinson, we can pass them on to you if you don't want to speak right now. But now is a good moment. We have a few minutes. If there's anything that you'd like to ask, please do. In the meantime, if I don't see responses, I'd just like to ask you, Richard, because we just started touching on the Opus 74 and 95, the other 2 quartets that don't fall in between. Could you perhaps just tell us a little bit about how those 2 came about, because they don't sort of sit right in the early, middle, or late camps in a way?
Yes. Well, yes, that's right. We have the 2 so-called stray quartets. Opus 74 from 1809, the so-called harp quartet. It's called the harp because it's got lots of pizzicato effects in the first movement. Beethoven wrote this quartet not to any commission, as far as we know, but simply because, you know, there was a demand among publishers for string quartets, especially Beethoven string quartet. Although the Razumovskys were regarded from the very beginning, and still are, as I said, as difficult music, challenging music, nevertheless, they were quickly published, and people wanted to try and get to grips with them. Beethoven wrote the harp quartet 3 years later, and it's slightly easy, although the first violinist probably wouldn't say that, because there's an amazing piece of virtuosity at the end of the first movement, like a concerto. But on the whole, the harp is a less demanding, slightly shorter as well, work than the Opus 59 quartets. So Beethoven, you know, really responding to the market, you know. With Opus 95, which we sample at the very end there, you feel it's something Beethoven had to get out of his system. Again, he was sure that he'd find a publisher. He could always be sure of several publishers, but he needed to write this quartet, which he called Quartetto Serioso, and he said it should only be performed in front of a small group of listeners. It should never be performed in public. Of course, it's been performed thousands of times in public since Beethoven's death. And he wrote this high pressure, concentrated string quartet. You feel there's something intensely personal there. Music, he needed to express something within himself in this 20-minute action-packed quartet. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Tiffany has a question. It popped up very quickly and I couldn't read it fast enough. So if she wants to unmute herself,
yes, please.
By all means do. Tiffany. Is she there?
About when did he start turning deaf and how did it impact?
Ah, yes. Well, I mentioned at the beginning, didn't I, the so-called Heiligenstadt Testament in 1802. It was really between the years 1800 and 1802 that he started to notice more and more that he couldn't hear the highest frequencies. I think it was particularly the upper frequencies that he couldn't hear. So, you know, 1802, he was 32 years old at the end of that year. That is when he realized that there was a serious problem. But it's interesting that over the next even 10 years, according to comments from his friend, his hearing didn't seem to deteriorate much. So the period that we're talking about here, you know, the Razumovsky period, 1806, and then on into 1808, 9, 10, etc. His hearing, from what evidence we have, sort of flatlined, but it was really after 1812, which is the year of the 7th and 8th symphonies, that it started to deteriorate more seriously when Beethoven was in his early 40s. And by around 1820, he was almost completely deaf, but not absolutely stone deaf, but he was almost completely deaf, and people had to write in the 1820s. They had to write their questions when they visited him. He had a lot of visitors. He would speak to them, but they had to write down in a notebook their questions to him. So he would have heard the Razumovsky quartets pretty well still.
Thank you very much, Richard. We've come to the end of our hour. So I would invite anybody, if they've got more questions, to please write to us and we can pass them. I mean, any points of discussion. These are wonderful pieces and you should all go and listen to them. What you've heard today is just small excerpts of quite amazing works, and you really should get to know them straight away if you don't already. I know a lot of them, you've played them already. But please do that, and we will be having the next talk, the next lecture on June the 23rd, Tuesday, June the 23rd, I'm not wrong.
On the late
same
quartets,
time,
yeah.
We'll start at 10. So that will be on the late quartets from Opus 127 onwards. So we'll need all to tune into that. Thank you, Richard. That was absolutely wonderful introduction to these pieces. We're very, very grateful that you've taken the time to shine light on the most fascinating aspects. And we look forward to the next talk.
My pleasure. Thank you, Charles.
Thank you, everybody.
And
have a lovely day, everybody.
Wherever you are.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.